What's going on, everybody? The last episode I did a teardown of the Seadoo Rotax 4-Tec motor, 1503. A lot of people call it a couple different things. And just got the block back from machining. Let's take a look. Got it all honed out, new crosshatch. Everything's ready to go here. We had to punch it out a half a mil over. Got some new pistons. These are coated ones. Got the rings and rods and everything pre-assembled. Next step's going to be throwing the motor together. So let's get going. Just some things to note when you're putting these motors together. On the piston, there's an arrow. Arrow always faces towards the exhaust side in the 4-Tec motors. Next step's going to be putting in these squirters. You can't forget to put them in for each cylinder. You'll have oil pressure problems, all sorts of things. There's going to be 3 of these, and they get torqued to 159 inch-pounds. 1 per cylinder. Where did that? There it is. Got our thrust bushings. I usually lube them up, put a little bit of assembly lube on the one side that's facing. It's going to be touching the face. And this one goes in like so. Usually I put them in like this and then I just kind of turn them around. That one's in. Then we're going to put our next guy in. You got to make sure that these groove side goes towards the flats. Okay, got a little lip on there. And this one goes in like so. You're going to just drop it in like that. And now that sets your counterbalance end play. And then when you put the other case on, it's going to hold those down. And we're going to do the same thing for the crank once I go get that and bring it over. Got our crankshaft all cleaned up. Shit's ready to go. If you see right here, there's one side for a thrust bushing, bearing rides, same thing there. So everything's all pre-lubed up and we're ready to drop it in. Big thing is just make sure you don't hit any of these rod ends. You're gonna have to line at least one of them up. It's gonna be this one. That's lined up. This one will be lined up. Still gotta put in these thrust bushings, bearings, whatever you want to call them. So I put a little assembly lube on them. Get them nice and slippery and lubed up. And this one's gonna go in this way. Usually try and push the crank one way so that I can get it to line up and hold it in place like that. I got the crank all in. I got the counterbalance in. I just want to show you. There's 2 marks. That's what you gotta line up. While you have the crank back off or off before you do what I did, so I didn't, because I forgot. Don't forget to put in the chain guide as well. My GoPro decided to not work, but I torqued these, all the rod ends, caps to 33 foot-pounds and then a full 90 turn extra. So that's all done. So basically we're at the point now where make sure all the bearings are in place like they should be, and we'll get the bottom of the case ready to go and bolt that down. All right, we're on to our final step here. I got the case deck all clean, rod bolts are done, everything's lined up. All right, we got the bottom of the case all cleaned up, the deck surface, all this is clean, bearings are all in, timing marks are in, timing chains on, timing chain guides on, squirters for back of pistons are in, and We got the end cap for the end of the crank. And now the only thing we got left to do is got to put a little bit of sealant along this edge, a little bit here, this edge, and a tiny bit here and here. So we'll start doing that. You don't need a lot. It's a machine surface, so it's gonna all squish out. Put a little sealant on this guy, even though it's got an O-ring, I always put a little sealant on it. Because I'll tell you right now, owning one of these jet skis, if it leaks the slightest amount and then gets in the hull every time you go out, it's the most annoying thing in the world. Caps in. You should just wipe off the extra. Okay. We'll just take a gander. I think we're all in good shape here. So let's get this bottom case on. We got a pre-lubed up assembly lube. And that's that. Got all the bearings in. Make sure all these guys are in right. That one's in. All the bearings are flush. Alright, we can throw the case on. Onto the rod bolts, the main bolts. We'll get new ones of those too. The old ones are stretch as well. Got our main bolts. Throwing Loctite on them as requested in the manual. 243, which is like medium strength Loctite, or blue Loctite is like everyone calls it. So, just gonna pre-lube these up. As per the manual, they want you to do 2 torque settings, 29 foot-pounds and then a final 41. This is number 1. Now we got to move on to all these smaller bolts. They're 17 foot-pounds. And that should wrap the bottom end up. Hey guys, what's going on? I just want to go over a couple things because my camera decided to error out and have problems with the videos I took the other night. Just a couple key notes. Pistons. Make sure ring end gaps are 120 degrees from each other. Helps with blow by. That's important. Make sure the rod end caps are on the right way because they are cracked sintered rods, so the caps only go one certain way. For the oil squirters, you got to make sure those are in here underneath, that squirt into the top of the underneath of the pistons. That keeps you from having low oil pressure and things like that. And you also make sure the bolts, they have a check bowl in them, check valve, make sure that they're free and there's no dirt in them. The rod ends, I'm going off the manual here. Rod ends are going to be, let's see, 33 foot-pounds plus 90, they're torque to yield. What else? The squirters are 159 inch-pounds, make sure those are in. Bottom of the case bolts are going to be 41 foot-pounds. First torque is going to be 31 foot-pounds. And then final thing, I just want to make sure, I don't know if the video got messed up or not, but just make sure number 4, number 4, number 6, make sure those are in. They're thrust bushings or washers or whatever you want to call them, thrust bearings. They set the end plate for the crank, set the end plate for the counterbalance. Those are really important things to make sure are correct. And finally, let me unwrap this. I always cover the blocks at the end of the night, keep dust and things like that from getting in. I find it pretty important. I think most engine builders do that too. Finally, we got our pistons all in. I don't know if the other got it, but there's a arrow facing towards the exhaust side. That's an important factor. Make sure you have set up. And finally, you want to make sure that your counterbalance and your crank line, here's one of the lines and the other one of the lines, line up when everything's set up properly. And also do not forget, because I forgot, because it happens, timing chain must be put on the crank and the guide prior to putting the crank in, because otherwise you can't get it in. There's a dowel pin over here that you can't get it in. And there's also a piece of the block that won't allow you to put the timing chain in. So it is quite unfortunate if you have a broken timing chain. Essentially, you got to pull the whole bottom end apart and pull the crank out, change the timing chain. I know they make some that have links, like a master link you can put in. Not a huge fan of them, but I figured I'd just give you a little update. Where we're at right now. Final thing to do with the bottom end is put all these caps in, which I have not done yet. And those are going to be torqued to, let's see, 18 foot-pounds. So that'll be the final thing before we put the head on and accessories and set up the timing and everything like that. All right, so let's move on to the caps and then we'll go from there. The final thing I forgot to mention that I missed, that is also important, which I've done with this block prior to building. Everyone should do this. I don't do it to show everything because it takes forever. You want to make sure that your ring end gap for all sets of rings is within spec. You also want to make sure that there's enough side play in the rings in between the gaps, the ring landings, to make sure they move freely. You want to check your end play on your crankshaft and on your counterbalance shaft to make sure they're within spec. I have had issues in the past, not from building the motor incorrectly, but I have had pumps come loose where the impeller comes off because you let off the throttle real hard and it free spins and it unthreads and it puts pressure on the end of the crank and winds up wiping out the thrust bearing, thrust washer, bushing, whatever you want to call it, closest on our side, and it winds up wrecking the crank. I have one I could show you guys one day what it looks like after it's totally trashed, but there's really no, I mean, the only solution fixing is welding the block up, bringing it to machine shop, having it hardboard and then line honed. Honestly, it's not really worth it. It's usually cheaper just buy a used block in good shape on eBay or something like that. All right, we're gonna put these caps on. It's gonna be 243 Loctite, medium strength blue, and they're going to be torqued to 18 foot-pounds. Got all these caps on and got them torqued down, and I put Loctite on them, and I had bought an extra container of Loctite because I use it so often, and I don't know if this is the original bottle, and this is the bottle I bought. So I start pouring the new bottle in, and everything seems kind of weird. This consistency's not the same. I don't know if this is a Chinese market one or if it's a knockoff, because it is not the same thing as this one. So I don't know. Keep an eye out if you guys use this that often. Next step's gonna be throwing this motor mount on, 18 foot-pounds and Loctite. Gonna get the front oil pump on next. Only thing to keep in mind here is I take this apart, I look at everything, make sure it's good. Usually I replace them. 89 inch-pounds blue Loctite. When you're putting this whole thing together, just make sure you have the filter screen in here and make sure this is indexed to the counterbalance. And make sure you have a gasket, obviously. So usually I'll put it in and then I'll turn it to get it to index. And that's it. Now I put the bolts on, 89 inch-pounds with blue Loctite. All right, next step's going to be installing the head and the head gasket. First thing you're going to want to do is make sure there's no oil on the deck surface. I usually clean it down with acetone. After that's done, I set the head in place with a new head gasket. Always use a new head gasket, obviously. And then the bolts are going to have oil in the threads, oil underneath the head of the bolt, so you get an accurate torque reading. And we're going to torque them to, let's see what it says, 30 foot-pounds, and then we're going to do a 120 degree rotation after that to get the proper yield. We got our deck surface and our head both cleaned off, no oil in them, used acetone. Got a brand new head gasket, make sure not to touch anything on it. You don't want any oil or residue or anything on it. This is an OEM Seadoo one, I've had the best luck with these. Other ones I've had a lot of blown head gaskets, so I would recommend buying the Seadoo factory one. I've even tried a Cometic one, still had problems, so I would recommend using one of these. Make sure your bolt holes line up, dowel holes line up. We are ready to rock. That's on. Now we just gotta bolt her down. Make sure she's sitting flat. Everything's good here. And that's it. Let's torque her. Alright, we got the head in place, we got the bolts oiled, and we got the bolts bottomed out, just not tight yet. So now we're gonna go into our first torque sequence, 30 foot-pounds. We're gonna start here. Alright, we're now on to the next part of the head torque. We're going to torque at 120 degrees, and then the final torque will be 90. Alright, that's it for torquing the head. Just gotta get these last two little bolts. Finally is these last two guys, 89 inch-pounds with Loctite, end of the block. These are the ones that people most commonly forget to take out when they're trying to get the head off and crack it. So just make sure you take them out and make sure you put it back in. Also, I recommend putting the side cover on last, just in case you drop these. Plus, sometimes you drop the chain for the timing, and it's a lot easier to pull it up later. The next step before installing the ring gear, stator, magneto, and trigger ring for the crank is going to be putting in the starter gear drive with the Bendix and all. So let's do that first, because otherwise you can't get it on if the ring gear is on already. Here's our drive. I want you to lightly oil it, especially where the bearing rides. Get that going. There's no washer on this side. But on this side, make sure we're in all the way. We are not in all the way. This guy fell off. Put my finger in here, maybe hold it. There we go. Now we're in. You better be careful when you go to put this together. There are two wave washers and a flat washer that goes on this side of the block. And a lot of times what happens is when you take it apart, you lose one of these, they fall off. So two wave washers, each wave facing each way, and the washer on top. But I put these on last just to make sure I don't lose them. Next step is going to be installing the ring gear. It's got an alignment pin. Line that up first. Make sure that lines up and drops in place. Perfect. Your trigger ring for your crank position. Again, that's also dowel pinned on the crank. That's in place. Your magneto, stator. No alignment, just needs to be bolted down. Next step is going to be installing the flywheel bolts. I don't reuse Seadoo ones, I use ARP bolts. They're not that expensive, they're good security, and they don't fail. I mean, the factory ones have failed. I know they've made updates, they haven't failed recently, but for peace of mind, I use these. It's simple, no torque to yield, total of 28 foot-pounds, red Loctite, should never have a problem. Another thing I want to note, when you go to tighten it, you need to have a crank locking pin right here. It goes in the side of the block, locks the crank in place. You don't need a flywheel holder or any of that stuff. Just get a locking pin for here. And you're also going to need a locking pin for the head. And now we're going to torque these ARP studs at 28 foot-pounds. Step's going to be keep the crank locked out, lock out the cam. We got to get the timing gear set on here and get it as close to 0 as we can. Make sure before we start anything, we're going to line everything up. We're going to throw in the oil cap and the plunger to put tension on the oil tensioner, and also going to slide in this guide here to get an accurate. And now you're going to want to get these two lines as perpendicular, as parallel to this head as you can. I've never found them to ever be perfectly parallel. Generally what I do is I do that, I know it's in a good position, and then when I'm done and the motor is in the ski and everything, I do a compression test, because the position of this gear, top gear, will dictate what compression you make, and that can give you, it's a good indication of how much, if the timing is in the right spot. I usually shoot for around 140 psi in each cylinder. I find that to be pretty optimal, and then that's about it. I would say I think this is probably what scares people the most, is setting up the timing, because this is an interference motor. It's really not all that hard. It seems more complicated than it really is. Really, all we're going to do now is get this gear in here, and we're going to get the chain on the outside, and we're trying to get these two lines parallel. It's really all we're trying to do. And really the final test is doing compression tests. Are we close? Okay, we're on. Pretty close to straight right now. We still need to put this chain guide in. Got the chain guide right here. Slide that in. Okay. We're still pretty close. I don't know if you can tell. Maybe a light will help a little bit. Mark here, mark here. This will be the next piece. Right here. Goes in like so. Usually put a little oil on it. Get it nice and lubricated up. That's gonna go in there. It slides in real nice. And then that is what's gonna set your chain. We can loosely put in the bolt, because it will change as it gets oil pressure. Just to hold things in place here. And now we are pretty close to level. I don't know if you can see that. We are pretty close to level. One's a little bit that way, but as we get more tension on this, we'll do a compression test to really check things out here. Now what you're going to do is you're going to put these bolts in. We got all the bolts in place, as you can see. Our two marks are as close to parallel as we can get them. I will tighten these up, but not snug, no Loctite. And then what we'll do is, once this motor's in, I'll come back here, do a compression test, and see if we need to adjust this a little bit. And then I would use the top cam lockout to adjust timing, and till I get to that 140 psi mark, and then I know I'm usually pretty good, right around there. Now it's time to get going on putting this back case on. Like I said, very important. Your first wave washer, like that. Second wave washer, facing down, cup. The first one's gonna be cupped up, the second one's gonna be cupped down, and then finally, put the washer on. We got our washers on. The first one's gonna be cupped up, second one's gonna be cupped down, and then you put your flat washer on, and that buttons up everything in here for us to put on the back case cover with oil pump, water pump. So we're gonna move on to that next. Next step is gonna be getting our gasket on the rear, and then getting the back cover on. Lining up the dowel pins, lining up that, and next steps, we get the cover on. Put a little oil on the bearing for the starter and make sure this is clocked properly so it slides into the counterbalance. This rear case is a combination of long and both short bolts. I usually start with the long bolts. Big common mistake, people try and get this case off without taking the water pump off, and there's a hidden bolt and they crack the case. So if you're ever taking one apart, make sure you got the water pump off and this bolt off, because you can't really see them. And last step is going to be tighten all these case bolts down to 89 inch-pounds. And that's a wrap for the back of the case. Next step's going to be water pump, oil cooler, starter, supercharger, and then eventually we'll get the timing once we put this whole thing in the motor, in the jet ski. Next step we got is going to be installing the crank sensor. That goes down here. Just make sure it's clean. And one of these bolts comes out. I put it on too soon and it bolts this down. Single bolt, Loctite as usual, 89 inch-pounds. I'm going to work on putting the oil filter in. Got our filter and cap ready to go in. I don't know if you guys know already, I'm sure you do. I always buy genuine OEM Seadoo filters, Rotax filters. They have this wire mesh on the outside, and I've had the cheaper ones, and I've used them like once, and it's not wire mesh, it's like fabric mesh, and those are the filters that collapse. So I always buy Seadoo OEM. It's not even really that much more money. It's worth it, I would say. And now we're ready to go. We got our washer, got our 2 new O-rings, and they're covered with oil. We'll line these lines up. There we go. Our next step is going to be getting our filler neck on and the bracket that bolts to the block. Again, 89 inch-pounds, blue Loctite. Next up here is going to be installing the water pump. Again, bolts are 89 inch-pounds and blue Loctite. There are 2 long water pump bolts. Both of them go in the top of the water pump. The rest of the bolts are your standard short bolts. Prefer to use Norma clamps on these. They don't chew up the hose as much. It's also the same clamp that they use for the bottom right here with the bearing. The next step is going to be putting on the engine mount. Again, blue Loctite. It's going to be 18 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to move on to the opposite side. This would be port side of the motor, engine mount. 18 foot-pounds. Next step is going to be installing the oil cooler. Keynote, make sure both these O-rings are in here, because if they're not, you're going to have oil leaks, and that's not fun. These screws are going down, or bolts are getting tightened to 89 inch-pounds. The next step is going to be installing the oil cooler lines. The first oil cooler line, that's the furthest one closest to the front of the motor, hooks up to the furthest barb in the back side. And the one that's closest hooks up to the barb right over here. I like to reuse single ear clamps and clamp them down and crimp them. The only one I put a hose clamp on is for the water overflow, for when I'm taking the motor in and out. Next step is going to be installing exhaust manifold. Blue Loctite on all the bolts, 89 inch-pounds. Just make sure the dowel pins line up. Got all the bolts in, got Loctite on every bolt, and now we're going to torque down to 89 inch-pounds. Don't forget to put these in place. And that's it for the exhaust. Next step is the knock sensor, 18 foot-pounds. Next step, we're going to install these spark plug tubes. Next, we're going to install the oil dipstick tube. This part just gets pushed in. Eventually, when you put the intake manifold on, this locks into it. Pretty much goes just like that. Next step is going to be installing the drive shaft boot with bearing. Here I use a Norma clamp. Remember, it's going to be a little angled because the motor doesn't sit in the jet ski straight. You want to make sure there's no tears in this, and you want to make sure it's on pretty tight because there is oil pressure back here. And if this thing pops off, you're going to just pump all the oil out of the motor. And that's pretty much a wrap for this. The only thing we got to do next is put the supercharger on, but that goes on after this goes in the jet ski. Intake manifold, that goes after. I put oil in it afterwards because if I do it now, it will pour out of here. The tops valve we're going to put on last because we're going to have to probably change the timing a little bit once we get the thing able to be cranked over. And the only thing left really is put the starter on, but I can't put the starter on right now because it's on an engine stand. Once it's hanging from forklift or engine hoist or whatever, I'll put that on and we'll get it installed.